we're continuing talking about Maya courts as places of opportunity and danger, but places where real humans lived. And that's something that hieroglyphic inscriptions and images can kind of give us a little bit of real people. It's kind of hard to imagine real people behind material evidence, but they're there. They have their lives. This is the landscape we're talking about, and you can see it's a very fragmented landscape. A friend of mine, Alex Safronov, he used GIS and terrain data to map how far you could walk in a day. And as you can see, the distribution of major capitals is pretty consistent with those distances, kind of core areas, and they get smaller if you're in the mountains. And the river presents its own set of opportunities, but also barriers. And as you enter flatter terrain, then suddenly territories become a little bigger because they're easier to control. So it's a very fragmented landscape where pretty much everybody is engaged in one big trade war that keeps happening all the time. The control of a major trade routes, all of these kingdoms in one way or another, they are here because those amazing quetzal feathers, chocolate beans, jade, obsidian, they have to go from Guatemalan highlands to the rest of Mexico. And this is the easiest way to get them there. And then through the Gulf of Mexico and further inland to places as far as the present-day capital of Mexico. And that's the way it was done at the time of the Spanish conquest. And that's the way it was done in the first millennium AD. So there's a lot of competition there. It is the only place in the Maya area where you actually see titles which reference transportation, like Principal Canoe Captain or He of Canoes. And that means that those people are important in the fabric of the political life. The fact that you are in charge of transportation can actually mean that you are very close to the king. Well, they actually have a big river that they can use for transportation. That helps too. In the early 6th century, Piedras Negras rises as the key player. And it's interesting because the site itself is in a small valley. It's landlocked completely, but it's also a very defensible location. So this is not a great place to build an economic powerhouse about agriculture or any kind of resource. The site itself doesn't have a lot of resource, but as a choke point on the river, it's perfect. But it's hard for Piedras Negras alone to amass resources to control everybody else. It's like a safe fortress location. So in the early 6th century, it appears that they seek help from Mexico, from the great city of Teotihuacan, and they receive it. And in the second decade of the 6th century, they conquer everybody. And so here they are, pretty much with all the major kings of the Usumacinta River kneeling before them. It's a very, very straightforward representation of dominance. This is a slightly later representation of the same idea. The king of Piedras Negras, appropriately dressed as a Mexican ruler, right? Because they adopted those customs. And these are kneeling rulers from Upper Usumacinta, from Yeshulan, from Bonampak, from smaller places like Plan de Ayutla, all declaring their loyalty to Piedras Negras. The story that we're going to explore, though, is from the 8th century. And that's the story told on a panel from the main palace of Piedras Negras kings. You see it's a kind of fortress-like palace on a tall platform with rows of colonnaded halls and throne rooms. And that panel was found inside. It was associated with a funeral ritual. A burial of ruler 4 was opened by one of his descendants, probably his grandson. And he pushed this panel into one of the palace walls to celebrate that fact and remember one of the brightest moments in his grandfather's reign. Mid-8th century, the rivals from Yeshulan arrive at Piedras Negras seeking help. So Yeshulan is one of those former vassals. They too are basically a defensive location, a peninsula on the river with steep hills. Not great for agriculture, but a great place to put a fortress and then collect taxes from all the canoes passing in front of you. So Yeshulan itself, so here they are, Peter's Negros is over there, is a warlike kingdom. So we've looked at multiple war expressions. They all describe different aspects of war. Weapons fall down, cities burn or are chopped. You enter the tent of your enemy, you burn fire, you bind the weapons, you feed your weapons. One of the creepier expressions relating to warfare. The skulls pile up, the blood pools. All of these expressions, they illustrate the intensity of my warfare. And in a place like Usumacinta, where you actually have something to fight for, which is a trade route, they do fight. So Yahshua takes advantage of political instability at the end of the 7th century AD, when the great empire of sorts, the Communal dynasty, suddenly was defeated by Tikal, its former rebellious vassal, and the political landscape started falling apart. Piedras Negras at that time, of course, was no longer a Teotihuacan vassal or ally. They primarily relied on the same connection to Communal lords like everybody else. Suddenly, that major power in the north that pretty much guaranteed peace and stability was no longer there, and Piedras Negras was left to its own devices. And so Yahshua took advantage of that. There was a very successful and very shrewd ruler at Yeshulan, Itzam Kokach Balam the third, and he took advantage of the situation. He also struck an alliance with the side of Motul San Jose, the kingdom of Ica. So between the two of them, they hoped they essentially could pretty much rule most of the Upper Sumacinta and extend further into the sought-after location of all that amazing jade and obsidian, all those goodies located here in the Guatemalan highlands. Their kids got married, as it's very customary among the Maya, and they started waging wars against what at that time was a major kingdom of the Spilas. The problem was they lost. Sort of very Games of Thrones scenario. So between 741 and 744, they fight and they keep losing. Their royalty is actually captured by those Spilas and paraded. And we see their images on the monuments. So as you can imagine, it doesn't help the morale. And back at Yeshulan, as you can imagine, there are probably different parties. Some of them say, well, we just have to keep fighting till we get, another chance at that. And there are probably parties saying, why don't we just reestablish old alliances and work together with our former overlords at Piedras Negras? It kind of worked out in the past. Maybe this whole rule the whole my world is not working for us. So as you can imagine, that means that you have a dynastic conflict within Yahshua itself. So you have one party, one legitimate ruler trying to strike an alliance with Piedras Negras, and you have one party that basically are local extreme isolationists. And this is the time when the party of an alliance with Piedras Negras travels to Piedras Negras. And that's what the panel is telling us about. So this is this moment. And Yahshua, of course, is a very aggressive policy. Unfortunately for Piedras Negras, the isolationists, they actually win. So those pro-Piedras Negras members of the royalty, we don't hear of them again. They're probably assassinated. And Yahshua just keeps expanding, keeps fighting, and keeps basically vanquishing its foes, primarily those allies of Piedras Negras itself. Not only they continue fighting, they actually build a series of fortresses which block the entire valley between Yahshua and Piedras Negras. Sometimes there will be residences of provincial governors. Sometimes areas of easy passage between steep hills would be blocked by walls. So archaeologists, Charles Gold and Andrew Scherer, who mapped this landscape, found essentially an almost continuous line of fortifications. Very opportunistic. Sometimes these are just low walls, but presumably they had palisades and garrisons. And so the whole valley is now blocked. Things go so bad at Piedras Negras that people are buried with fake jades. It's the only site where people are buried with clay imitations of jade painted blue, because presumably they're cut off from all the trade. Yeshulan bypasses them from the east and starts conquering places to the east and north of Piedras Negras. So they're in kind of blockade. I'm sure Yeshulan is also probably suffering because it's hard for them to trade with Lower Sumacinta, but they don't care, right? They are dead set on breaking Peter's Negros, bringing it to its knees, and so that's what they're doing. Uh, they also change memories. Remember, Yeshulan is a former vessel. So Yeshulan is the only case that we know of in the case of the Mayan monuments when they remake ancient monuments. This is a stela that is completely redone. We know it because the lower section of the monument was left intact. It was in the ground, so nobody cared. And if you look closer, you'll see this is the chest of the protagonist, and that is the chest of the original protagonist, which is currently below the feet of the updated monument. And when we look at the old part, we'll see the date is actually the same. This is the week of the 9-day week, the patrons of the night, and it's the same patron. The length of the lunar month is listed here as 29. It's also 29 there. So the date most likely was the same. The Persian, we can only identify the name in the back on the ancestral mask. And here it is, it's the same. Tadbu Hol. What is interesting though, the orientation of the figure changed. You can also see that the original monument was much, much taller. So if this is the chest level, it means there was a huge panel with text that was erased entirely. So presumably that text was talking about Petrus Negros a lot. That was no longer okay. If there was anyone facing the king, like a member of the family, like a prince, an incorrect prince of some sort, not only they raised that prince, they made the king look another way. Literally turned his back on whichever undesirable person was depicted down there. No other side, as far as I know, went to that extreme. And the thing is, they didn't destroy the monument. No, they recarved it entirely with those ancient dates from the 7th century, right? So it's not like they talk about something you know. It's the same monument, only better, because it excludes all of the facts they don't want to talk about. Very much like those totalitarian regimes from like 1984. And they did it to several monuments, not just one, but at least 3 monuments were recarved that way. And an entire hieroglyphic stairway. Hieroglyphic stairway 1. It's all recarved. The only problem there was that they couldn't recarve some areas, and they presumably just blanked them out and they put some stucco in, and now the stucco is gone, so you kind of see that it was recarved. So why go to these extremes? Well, they wanted to control the narrative. So officially in Yahshua history, nothing happened for 10 years. Between 741, 751, nothing happened. That was their official line. Totally nothing. And then after that, Yahshua was back in the game and conquering neighbors. Everything was just fine. They don't mention war with those fields that they lost, of course, either. They don't mention anything fake, too, right? That's not the way my propaganda works. They just don't talk about it, right? Raised as if it never existed. They do mention victories, and it's very important. In between the events that we're going to talk about on the panel and at the time when they actually carved the panel, Yeshulan aggressively conquers. And when we look at the direction of their conquest, they pretty much cut Petrus Negros further and further on either side of the landscape. They try to encircle it and bypass it, obviously, for trade, right? So if they control all these sites, it's like a monopoly game. Once they collect all of these major dots, they hold a trade monopoly. And so they feel like they're winning. And Petrus Negros obviously feel like they're losing. The only major win for Petrus Negros would be the kingdom of Communal, like a key node on the Masinta River. Towards the late 8th century, they will manage to conquer it or reconquer it at some point. And that would be a major thing worth celebrating on some of the largest monuments ever carved at Petrus Negros. But that would not help them, of course, because Yeshulan would bypass them on either side. So it was a really dire situation. And as you can imagine, Petrus Negros still was in need of some kind of narrative. And it was kind of makes sense. It kind of makes sense that out of spite and out of enmity for Yeshulan, to actually mention those gap years that Yeshulan wouldn't talk about. And that's what the story on the panel is. So during those gap years, an emissary or a delegation of Yeshulan arrived. It included that king of Yeshulan during that so-called interregnum years, who was an ally of Petrus Negris. And they obviously wanted to work together, except that it didn't work out, and we'll also talk about what actually happened then. But this is sort of the main story. It starts with an anniversary of the local ruler. So local ruler, Itzam Anak, Itzam, precious turtle, named after the terrestrial form of the creator god, completes Tutzach, his 120-year cycle in office, so an anniversary of his accession. And then we see that it is seen or witnessed white canoe something Yopad Balam. So presumably he's some kind of canoe party. So you can imagine like a bunch of white canoes arriving down the Masinta. These guys unload. And this is that interregnum king, Yopad Balam, a divine lord of Pachan. In 2 days, they dance with the descending Makkah, or in descending Makkah dance. And of course, this is Itzam Kanak again, holy king of Yokib. And then at midnight, they drank with some chocolate, with some either hot or evaporating chocolate. So there was also chocolate, but they primarily drank. It's anti-passive ukun, which means doesn't mean what they specifically drank. What really matters is they drank. So you have Itzam Kanak, Ina Hao, that's his second title, a major capital further sort of west and north of Piedras Negras. And it happened presumably at Piedras Negras. That location was carefully removed by an axe of someone from Yeshulan when they finally got their hands on that panel. You can actually see that on that panel, and we'll look closer at it at some point, there's not a single head that is preserved. Not because they wrote it away, but because someone made sure that there'll be no heads left. So at some point, Yahshua had full access to the palace, and that's what they did. That's what we call a hostile termination. They did, presumably, to the living people too, but they were not happy with just eliminating the living. They wanted to do something to the history of that site as well. Their images, their ba, and of course, they were not interested in replacing it with anything, because that was something that they had in the enemy capital. So they just destroyed and smashed every monument that they could lay their hands on. There are no standing monuments at Piedras Negras. They're all taken down or broken. So then 8 years later, the king passes away, and then expires his white spirit and soul. Once again, someone removed it a little bit. And then 3 days later, he is buried in Five Flower Mountain, presumably the location of his burial. It's interesting, even that supernatural location is contested between Yahshua and Piedras Negras. So Piedras Negras say their kings go to Five Flower Mountain. Yahshua, as we know from the monuments, they say their kings go to the Five Flower Mountain. It's kind of interesting, they agree on the fact that kings go to Five Flower Mountain when they die, because they're obviously from the same kingdom, right? But they disagree on which kings actually go to the Five Flower Mountain. And then after 24 years after that event, we have El Nahach Umukil Itzam Kanak. So fire entering or incense on the burial of Itzam Kanak. And it's interesting, archaeologists actually excavated that burial. And it looks like all the bones have been moved sideways. A lot of objects have been removed, and there's ash from burning everywhere. So that was the ancestral veneration ritual that ruler 7, mentioned here, undertook. So his name was Inichiat Ak, resplendent turtle tooth, or the sting of a turtle. And he carries the title, he of one, and that's an undeciphered sign that may be a number. Logically, that would be like 400. And then Nak, probably conquest. Remember, there's something of an inflation of how many captives you can take. The rivals at Yeshulan claim that they have, on average, 20 captives. So at Pietros Negros now, they're probably upping the scale to one magnitude higher. Not that it helps, actually, in practice, but nonetheless, that's part of the rhetoric. So that's the end of the main inscription. But of course, nobody wants to read the main inscription. What really matters is the scene. And the important part about it, it's a retrospective scene, right? So this is sort of the summary of the main text. Just a typical ancestral ritual. But then you have this. And it's obviously not dancing. It's obviously not the king dying. It's not the king acceding to kingship. It's that feast, presumably, that they want to show. The very moment before they actually start drinking or eating. So they're holding cups. Nobody's drinking. And you have visitors. Those facial expressions and head orientations are invented. It's unlikely that they were facing the opposite way. Most likely the king was talking, gesturing towards the visitors, and the visitors were showing submission and respect. But anyways, at this point, we as viewers, as witnesses, would probably see the curtains going down, and then the rest of the conversation would happen in a more private setting. So this is presumably the most important part, the beginning part, when each of the two parties presents its case or has a conversation. And the organization of space is important too. This is the king. He's sitting on a very obvious throne, carved as a mountain of sorts. And then even seated, he's higher than everybody else. At the same level as the throne, you see members of his household and visiting royalty. So these are all princes of royal blood, except one or two, maybe bodyguards, maybe household priests, but their names are also unusual, suggesting that they perhaps also have some royalty in them. And then princes, two princes. So this is royalty, and this is everybody else. Like non-royal people, they all sit on the same level below the feet of the road. So it's a very hierarchical presentation. Also, you can see that the king's household is on the right-hand side, and the king is on the right-hand side of the visitors. That's also a very common convention. It's kind of interesting contrasting it to a household of a common official. They all sit on the same bench, right? And there's only one servant who mentions about summoning the youth or assembling the youth or the warriors. And then they all have a conversation as equals. The principal Ahau, the Lakam, prominent members of the community. So that's what happens at the communal setting, right? They all sit on the same bench and share a meal. They also have a cup of chocolate to share amongst themselves, right? Quite possibly the very same cup that is painted. You can see this cup is quite large, right? That's the size of this painted cup. It's this big, actually. It is indeed that large. You can hardly hold it in your. But I guess it's not meant to be consumed alone, right? This is the idea that all these people are going then to pass this cup along amongst themselves. So this is a very different setting. Now the visitors, they probably don't look away. They actually look towards the king, and they are speaking. They say, "Hot, you, our guardian, for 17, 20-year cycles." So 340 years. It's interesting that they use the term kachan, the same term that is used for the captors, but also for those who look after young people, like chan, like guardians. Like Piedras Negras, they're the only adults in the room. All their little children, all their vassals are squabbling among themselves, all these conflicts, and now one of their children come finally home and ask parents to sort it out, right? Because Piedras Negras is the chan. They are the guardians. They are the adults of those Sumacinta region. A very important metaphor. Very similar to the discourses you would expect in medieval Europe between vassals and overlords, right? This kind of pseudo-familial relationships. Like they're all part of one big family. And that topic actually continues. This hin hanal akushbich, your sustenance, your enlivening, presumably pointing to the food. and drinks as your grandfather Yeshurun had ordered. The idea is that grandfather, who was a vessel, and the second part of the speech highlights that, created a set of obligations which now the Piedras Negras king has to respect. So very, very medieval European too, this notion of obligations of honor created by previous loyalties, previous commitments.
Is that the same Yeshua that we were looking at the literal one?
Yes, that's the one who got recarved. Exactly, that's him. They couldn't mention that particular fact, so he got updated. It's a different Yeshua Balam now, an improved one. So his grandson, also Yeshua Balam, of course, is the one that is currently fighting Piedras Negras. So yeah, drinking, being happy. Then you have people who are close to the throne, and one of them is Kanmote, Principal Sahal. One interesting thing about these people, we see them elsewhere on Piedras Negras monuments. And it's interesting, this is the last representation of these people as far as when it was actually carved. So it's kind of a summary, but also perhaps a specific reference to that moment in time in 749, when they were gathering at that feast. So Kanmote, Principal Sahal, we see him earlier in 716, and he is Principal Throne, Batem. So he's like head civilian administrator. 749, he's in charge of the provinces. So I guess that is an indication of how those careers presumably shifted, right? He proved himself as an able administrator within the city or kind of civilian matters, and now he's in charge of the mass on the frontier. Kind of makes sense. You see, he's a even in 716, he doesn't look like a very young person. So he's one of those presumably most skilled operators. And now when Yeshulan factions are at war with each other, he's presumably on the border trying to sort it out. And you can see that he's actually seated as if he arrived with the guests. He's facing the opposite way. So he may kind of represent their case before the Lord of Piedras Negras. He's an ally of that particular party. And since he's Basahal, it kind of makes sense. Another person facing the opposite way is Tisakun, the king's speaker, so the substitute for the king in civilian matters. So the top position at the court besides the king himself. It's interesting that next to him is Yakchak, literally the turtle of the rain god. That's his name. And he is just Sahal from Bikil. Bikil is an important location in the city where carvers presumably lived. So it's very significant. What is interesting, though, there's a monument from 731 when we see young turtle of the rain god, who is the crown speaker. This kind of suggests that between 731 and 749, he was essentially demoted or sent to the provinces. He's still there. He's still close spatially to the top level of the administration, but he's no longer the crown speaker. So that once again suggests that those positions that were shifting, it's not like you're appointed, you can keep it for life. Apparently politics happens. Next to them, there are two people from the same family, Mushkans. It's kind of family surname. And it's the only family in the entire scene that is represented by two members. It's very interesting. And remember, this is a retrospective scene, 20-something years after the fact. So this is about, actually 30 years after the fact. It's about the importance of these people, presumably in the fabric of the Piedras Negras society. One of them is a high priest. And that's the only person besides royalty who is actually speaking. And he speaks, "I am your manheart of the sky." A declaration of loyalty. Once again, perhaps significant in retrospect, like who was really loyal. And then we have Jumping Peccary, Olol Chitam, of Sahal of Mushkal, so provincial ruler. So once again, these people must be important. We know Mushkan people from other references. This is that panel from Dumbarton Oaks, the biography of a Sahal who got a job. He danced with the king. Remember that story. Now, he got his job, and then he married a lady from Mushkan, because we know it when his son's parents are mentioned, his mother is of Mushkan. So these people are influential within like the fabric of the non-royals. They're all intermarried, of course, with each other. They're all distant relatives of each other. As you can imagine, over the centuries, same principal families. One interesting part about the scene, there's not a single person from El Cayo. El Cayo is a very important place. It's right here. That's basically like a fortress that protects the southern edge of the Piedras Negras realm. It's a big city, under investigated, unfortunately, up to this day. At first, it was about civil war. Now it's about the war on drugs. But it's an area where it's hard to work. Epigrapher Peter Matthews famously had to escape swimming when he was chased by the locals, and swam for quite some time amidst the crocodiles of the Usumacinta River until he was rescued by one of the smugglers. So good swimming skills are apparently essential if you do epigraphy in the Usumacinta. You never know when you may have to swim for your life. So at El Cayo, we're tough people like this person of who Danny Trucker seems to be a reincarnation of. I mean, look, they're identical. Like even the broken nose is there, the mustache, the knife. The knife, of course, is currently stuck in the heart of someone. Unfortunate, so it's still there, but you can kind of guess the average length of the knife. It's about the same. So I can only see the handle sticking out of the human heart there.
We see a lot of like mustaches, like a lot of facial hair.
No, not a lot. But this guy has, and it's exactly the same design, as you can see. So these people, El Cayo people, they're kind of dynasty. They pass on to the members of their family, although not necessarily father to son. Like this guy, for example, he says in his parentage statement that his father was a chog. So his father never got a job. He waited for 40 years, presumably, and then passed away. But nonetheless, within the same family, there is, though, a gap in the story. Sometime, like about the same time when we see that panel, 749. Nothing seems to be happening. No monuments from El Cayo officials. Presumably, there's some trouble there. An interesting part of those troubles, so once they resume putting their monuments, we know that they switch their legends to the kingdom of Sakti. So they are serving two courts at once. They're going to Piedras Negras, but they also answer to the lords of Sakti. And if you look at the map, this is El Cayo. This is the kingdom of Sakti right here, presumably, and this is Piedras Negras. So El Cayo is kind of stuck in the middle. To make matters even more complicated, we know that the king of Sakti, who they answer to, is captured by Yeshulan in 766 between the two events mentioned on this lintel. And the fact that he's still around and not killed implies that he comes back, presumably now as a vassal of Yahshua. So it may explain why at Piedras Negras they don't want to see these guys. Even if they were at the scene, in retrospect, they don't want to see them because they are basically a bunch of traitors. Or let's say people who didn't have a problem switching sides based on political expediencies. So after all of the stuff that happened in the 60s and the 70s, in the 80s, when they're carving this panel, they don't want to see anyone from El Cayo there, even though they were the most important family of the kingdom, or the greatest magnates of the kingdom, presumably for that reason, right? They never had a problem switching sides when it was expedient. That's why they were so powerful and rich. So the trade goes on. There are also boys in the scene, which is also very, very fascinating. And they're members of the household. Although one of them, his name sounds like a tongue twister. In each, it's like, don't put so many glottals in one name. It's like you kind of wonder what his parents were thinking. Like, resplendent, fiery Quetzal. I mean, it sounds great in translation, but not in pronunciation. And he's Napte, and Napte is a term for heavy hand spear, literally hand spear. So he is the hand spear. So I wonder if he actually had some kind of weapon here, just not preserved. And so he was some kind of bodyguard. The only person with arms in the scene. That would also make sense as a kind of bodyguard behind the throne. Sometimes we see that, those people in the scenes. And then the next person is Ahun, priest. But his name is very unusual. It's basically like a Tikal royal name, Hasao Chan Awil. And that suggests that he's of some kind of royalty. And his presence in the scene is significant, perhaps as a reference to some other royal family from the east, from Patan, from the central kingdoms, who was serving at the time as Ahuns at the court of Peter's Negro's rulers. So then there are two boys. One of them is called Ulchik, rabbit Koati, or and young your keyboard, and then a macaw turtle chuck. And of course, that would be like a youth name, right? After you become king, you get something more appropriate. But if you never become king, then you never get a royal name. And that's where it gets interesting. That's where the story gets really interesting, because you see these boys and you understand they're here, presumably because it's important. Because there are no other kids in the scene. The king, in the middle of the scene, he actually has two sons who become kings. One of them is Nishon al-Ak the third. The other one is Hak in Shok, or Hatao Hak in Shok. The Hak in part is uncertain in terms of how to read it. Probably it's just a different logogram. Nonetheless, they're not here. So they're actually two sons who ruled, and they're not in the scene. So what happens is that this guy abdicates. This guy abdicates in 780, and the person who succeeds him, ruler 7, he never mentions his parents. Never mentions his parents. And what is also interesting, he pays all the attention to the father of these two guys, ruler 4, Itzam Anak, but he never mentions these two rulers either. So you kind of wonder, okay, so these people obviously not important, or there's a problem with them. Well, this fellow is obviously a problem. The text actually says that he abandoned kingship, Yaktah Halil. He took the treasure, Uchuku Ikitz, and he fled to Lamna. This is the guy who basically said, I'm done, took all the treasures and ran. Well, out of former Guatemalan presidents, two are currently in jail, so it's a kind of time-honored tradition in that part of the world. But one of them is in the United States jail for money laundering. He actually fled Guatemala because he was aware of a possible case against him in Guatemala. And it was part of his campaign. He killed someone before he became president in self-defense, as he put it. But nonetheless, he plundered the state educational funds while he was president. And then he escaped with that money to the United States, but finally they got him here, and he's now serving his time, or maybe finished serving his time, I'm not sure. Haven't been keeping track. But nonetheless, after that, you kind of don't want to talk about that guy, right? The fellow who kind of, whose career ended in this rather unusual way. He's the only king we know who gave it away, like Yaktaha Haled, right? And fled with the treasures. So then it becomes really interesting what happened to that Ulchik fellow. If he is depicted there and not his presumably older brothers, then he must be important. And that was the time when scholars realized there is this very important piece of information, one of the Yeshulan monuments. And that monument didn't look like a big thing. So you have a Sael, a captain of Yeshulan kingdom, the king of Yeshulan, Yeshun Balam, the grandson of the last vassal of Piedras Negras. And then you have this fellow who is captured, Chuhka, and then you see Tulu Chiku, Tulchik. So there's our Tulchik. That's how his career ended. And that happens in 759, about the same time when the dynastic conflict at Yeshulan ends. So that was probably the end of Piedras Negras' efforts to help a party win the internal conflict at Yeshulan. Basically, sort of Game of Thrones scenario. They form the alliance, they go, and they lose. One of the Yeshulan kings is killed. The prince of Piedras Negras leading the army is captured. And that's the end of it. And of course, if you're captured, right? It's a big deal in the Maya world. You lose your Chabil Akbal, right? The text that we started with today, it's through Chabil Akbal that you can win the wars. Once you lose it, uh, it's over. And of course, you may not just die, you'll most likely be publicly tortured, you'll be publicly humiliated. At Yeshulan, they would probably make sure that nobody ever would treat you as a person after what they did to you in public. And we know that this notion of loss of dignity was very important to the Maya. Like having the nice fingernails. Apparently, someone was trying to explain to a Spanish priest why fingernails are so important. That was hard. And so they went through this whole passage about what losing fingernails signifies, right? I have no more fingernails. I am not what I used to be. Ended my power, authority, and money. I am worthless. And we do see very well-tended fingernails of some of my rulers. Perhaps not as long as this fellow. By the way, that was that Yahshua, that Motul Sakunser ruler who didn't survive the alliance with Yeshulan. He was captured. You kind of see that he was probably not a warrior material. His dad, Sael was fit, and this fellow in the bunny hat was not. So Siyah Huitzil Chankawil was probably not a very successful warrior king. It kind of looks like not a very successful warrior king. But nonetheless, after that, as you can imagine, what can you do with Tulchik, with his legacy, if he had any children, right? He was in his early 20s. He probably had children, he probably had a wife. So what happened to them? So currently what scholars believe is that's who ruler 7 was. He was one of Tulchik's children, perhaps his son, or perhaps his only son. And it's a very dangerous place to be. You have all these uncles with their own kids, right? You have your own father who was captured, humiliated, and probably killed in a very unpleasant way. And you cannot even mention his name because he died dishonorably. So it's a very, very dangerous place to be. And that's when the second person in the story comes in. That guy, Moak. He is the only other child mentioned in that panel. And he is not of Piedras Negras royalty. He is from a small vassal kingdom of Lamar, Petun. So it's another dependency ruled by a local royal family, not Sahals, not non-royals, but tiny royals, tiny dynasty. And these people are also oscillating between several major political players. But at that time, they're loyal to Piedras Negras. So presumably, Moak was something of a childhood friend. So when his buddy, Tulchik, was captured and killed, he was probably the one who sheltered his family. And presumably those Mushkan people, right? There must be a reason why they're there. 2 of them. So those were presumably parts of a faction, like within the royal court, that basically were the remains of that party that was behind that war with Yeshulan that failed in such a spectacular way. That alliance with one of the pretenders to the throne. So the survivors of that unsuccessful campaign, they were based at Lamar. And when that abdication happened, they took advantage. And so the moment ruler 7 becomes king, this fellow is raised amongst the nobles. Back at Lamar, he builds palaces. He dedicates monuments as big as Piedras Negras monuments almost. He credits himself with all the major military victories. And maybe he's right? So behind every lucky young king, there's probably a successful older politician, and that seems to be so the eminence grease of the Piedras Negras politics. This is Lamar right there. When they dedicate a new throne for their ruler 7, it's interesting. It's one of those rare monuments when behind the back of the king you see 2 men, rather than like mom and dad, which is the usual custom. You see 2 men. One of them is not named, and that's presumably the king's father, because you're not supposed to name him, because there are problems with mentioning his name. And the other person is Hunmai Ach Amo Chak. So that's the That's the ruler of Lamar. He's literally backing the king at all times. And this is the monument that celebrates their only major victory of that time, the victory over Pomona. As though these unfortunate captives from Lower Sumacinta, and this is our Moak, right next to the king, holding some kind of mean mace with a nice figural head, and obviously holding the ruler of Pomona, the king of Pomona, kneeling behind, before the victorious Piedras Negras ruler with lots of jade. I don't know whether that's intentional. This is one of the biggest jade pendants I've seen. I don't know how it's holding, but that seems to be the main message, right? The kingdom of Piedras Negras is back, and they dedicate this panel to reconnect with the old glory, remember the times when Yahshua knew its place, and it kind of makes sense as well. Elevate the memory of Tolchik. Right? That was the last thing, the last major event at which he was present when things were well, when things were okay, when things were on the right track. So this is kind of a restoration, a conservative restoration of Piedras Negras, and they connect those dots. It's a very Games of Thrones story, right? This is our ruler 7, the son of a young lord whose demise basically imperils his survival, right? And then you have this faithful ally, the Moak, who makes sure the young lord grows up and succeeds and becomes the next king. In a way, the end at that time seemed even happier, right? So the young lord actually becomes king. Of course, the real my world is even worse than the Game of Thrones, because about the time or shortly after they carve that panel and celebrate the victory over Pomona, Yeshulan finally gets to Piedras Negras in 808. There is this major campaign that ends with this fellow, and they describe Tsilil, not sure what they want to say, maybe shaking from terror, or maybe raised as on an altar. Probably the second option. It's like a participial, is raised, not has been, but is as they carve it, or at that moment. Mat abil magbal inichiatak. So that's the end. Yeah, he's done. He's done. He has no penance, no darkness. And in between those events, they mentioned them campaign. That must have been a major strategic breakthrough. What Yeshulan did. So this is Yeshulan. This is El Cayo. El Cayo, apparently no one tries to capture El Cayo. It's hard. So and they already control kingdoms east and northeast of Piedras Negras, but there's no direct access. There's only one narrow valley that you can go and pass El Porvenir and attack. But in order to get there, you need to somehow to control areas further north, and there you have the vassal kingdom of Pomona, which is now part of the Piedras Negras realm. So what people at Yeshulan do, you look at the place names they describe in that campaign. First, they attack a place of cedar trees. So that suggests that they go upslope from the valley of the river. And then they go to a place called either Green Mountain or Pinewood Mountain. So they go even higher. So instead of trying to break through the valley, which is protected by El Cayo, and there's no way they can get through, they cross the mountains. Sort of like Hannibal style. And they fall into the nearby valley. They attack Lamar itself. So they cross the mountain and they attack Lamar. And probably a move no one expected. And then they attack a place Suwulha, like low water, place of many turtles, and that suggests they're getting closer to the river, maybe like following this stream even. And then they attack the second city of the kingdom, the Kina. We are not sure where Kina was located. There's some debates, but it's not matched to an actual archaeological site. We know it's in that area. Maybe El Porvenir, maybe has some other site in that area. There's a cascadas of Butsi in that area too. So once at that point, Piedras Negras is completely cut off and surrounded by Yeshulan. And so the next stage, of course, they invade the city itself and capture the king. They also cut it from Sakti, the other kingdom of importance that could have potentially intervened. It doesn't matter anymore. So probably this fellow died first, right? Because they captured Lamar first, and then his protege followed. Uh, Yeshulan armies entered the palace. That throne, that's how archaeologists found the main palace room. Obviously, after many years, so its building collapsed. But this is the throne. Yeshulan warriors took that stone, they dragged it out of the niche, and then they smashed it into smithereens. So these are fragments of this throne, these stones. This was made of. And it's not like they just attacked it on the spot. No, they had to drag it. The supports are here, and they kind of turn inside out, suggesting that those were deliberate acts. Uh, and they attacked, as you can imagine, the faces. Those were knocked off with like hammer blows, and then they attacked the rest of the monuments. So all the major monuments were destroyed. Uh, and that was the end of Piedras Negras. The population, as you can imagine, never recovered after that. This is one of the few cases when we can document the end of the kingdom. Now, Yahshua didn't fare much better. I mean, when you do things like this to your enemy, your neighbors, they take notice. So shortly after that horrible attack on Piedras Negras, a campaign was mounted against Yeshulan itself. We don't know who did it. They left no inscriptions. We know that the last stand at Yeshulan took place in the main royal acropolis. There are actual dart points on all the access steps suggesting that there was a fight. And the defenders and attackers were throwing darts at each other. And the fact that the site was abandoned and no one cleaned those darts, just that was it. That was the last thing that happened there. Exactly. So that was the end of Yeshulan. It must have happened within a decade or so after this event. So they did reap the negative consequence of being sort of the worst neighbor in the area, the most aggressive kingdom. At some point, an alliance formed against them, and it didn't work out for Yeshulan.